Getting into Cambodia in 1980-81 was certainly not easy, and the main reason it was not easy was not because of the government, which was in fact very welcoming of international media, but because all the countries of ASEAN refused any kind of recognition of the new government in Cambodia. Just to put this in context, Cambodia from 1975 until this period, where it ended in 79, was the Pol Pot regime, the Khmer Rouge regime, which I'm sure you're all aware of, that was one of the most murderous regimes in history. The ASEAN governments never severed diplomatic relations with although they didn't have embassies in Phnom Penh, but they, if you were an Indonesian and you really wanted, if you could get access or get the visa, I mean, the Pol Pot regime was so isolationist, they didn't really bother, but it wasn't, so in other words, under Pol Pot regime, the problems of getting into the country was really a question of the Pol Pot regime. They didn't want anyone except their Chinese supporters to come into the country, and they had a lot of Chinese aid. The only flight into Phnom Penh during the Pol Pot regime was a flight from Beijing once a week. After the Vietnamese intervention in 1975, the Khmer Rouge were kicked out of power, and a new government, a new Cambodian government was put in its place. That new government tried to establish a normal society, which was, I mean, in other words, they wanted to have relations with everybody, and the problem was not the government, but the problem was attitudes towards the government, which was orchestrated by China, the United States, Thailand, Singapore. All these countries said, oh, Vietnamese invasion, very bad. We have to condemn this. They condemned it at the United Nations, and so they wanted to try and isolate this government. So it was exactly the opposite of the Pol Pot regime. Pol Pot regime wanted to be isolated. This government actually wanted everyone to come and see. The reason why they had been put in power by the Vietnamese was because of the extreme horror and terror, and that they didn't really matter for the people of Cambodia actually who came to rescue them. Most people in Cambodia were at that moment very happy that somebody had got rid of Pol Pot, somebody had got rid of the Khmer Rouge. Sure, you know, it was not a natural first choice for Cambodians to say, because there is a traditional enmity between Cambodians and Vietnamese. So Vietnamese would not be their first choice, nor was it their first expectation. But as you can imagine, it would be rather silly to have a long debate with any survivor of the Khmer Rouge nightmare about, well, wasn't it a bad idea to welcome the Vietnamese? But that was the kind of argument that was going on in the United States, saying, you know, oh, this is, you know, never mind Pol Pot, the Vietnamese are in there. That's really the, you know, of course the Americans' attitude had nothing to do with any concern for the Cambodians. Their concern was they had just lost the Vietnam War and they wanted revenge. They did not want Vietnam out of Cambodia at all. A member of the US National Security Council in the year 1980 or 81 said, let's not push negotiations at all. Let Vietnam bleed. And what he really meant was let Cambodians bleed. Because of course the Cambodians suffered worse than anybody, and also the result of the UN boycott was in 1979, October 1979, the UN decision of the General Assembly to continue to recognize the Khmer Rouge regime that no longer existed meant that no United Nations Development Agency could come to the people that needed it more than any other country in the world. Cambodia was in a state which was worse than the Congo today and worse than any country in Africa. All the schools have been either pillaged or destroyed, broken down. You know, education, as we know it, did not exist under Pol Pot regime. So the thing is, what this new government, with very few resources, made up mostly of traumatized survivors of the Khmer Rouge regime, somehow had to cobble together a government and rebuild their nation almost from scratch, which is why we often refer to it as Year Zero.